Hey, Byron, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks, Tim. Good to be with you.
Glad we were able to make this conversation happen. So, we all just heard your incredible bio and intro, but why don't you just tell us a little bit more about
Well, few people know that I am a trout enthusiast. I am found standing knee deep in moving water in the western slopes of the United States, casting a micro fly to rising trout. If I could do that every day, I would be probably extremely happy.
Yeah, they're going to be seeding out back here. I have a stream in my backyard, and they put trout in every spring. So here shortly, they're going to be putting fresh trout in there. Fly fishing is a lot of fun to do, and it's part of that. Is kind of being with nature, at least for me. I don't know about you.
No, I'm totally at peace in nature. I find my best thinking occurs when I'm not thinking about my problems and I'm just worried about where my line falls.
Absolutely. Talking about where the line falls, why don't you tell us a little bit about why you wrote your book?
Some years ago, I was in a meeting with a business owner and an attorney, and the business owner was looking for guidance on how they could sell their company to the management team. And I had not been a part of any of those discussions yet. And the attorney listened thoughtfully and asked a question that really killed the conversation, which was, well, do they have any money? And the business owner was, well, I don't know, probably not. And the conversation stopped. And it was like, well, really no alternatives. I was looking for a solution. And from that point on, it was my mission to identify alternatives to no, they don't have any money. And the alternative is, yes, let's create the money. Let's structure the transactions so that the business owner gets paid and the buyer is able to secure financing from a bank because of thoughtful planning, preparation that allowed the buyer to get what they want, which is control of a closely held business, and the seller to get what they want, which was financial security from that business.
When you've been doing this over the years, what do you find is probably the most overlooked solution to this problem?
Preparation, getting the buyers prepared for bank interviews. The due diligence that comes from the bank is, do I believe that this person's capable of managing the complexity in this business, dealing with the stress of being the owner, and ultimately repaying my loan? Banks are not in the business of making risky loans. The interest rate they earn is a reflection of the risk that the regulators have asked them to maintain. So their banks are looking for certainty. And so the business owners who want to sell to management tend to assume, well, I can just walk my people down to the bank and get them some money. And that is typically not the case unless your business is small enough that you can get a small business administration a guaranteed loan, which is a lot easier to do than a commercial finance non-guaranteed loan.
See, this is what we kind of call like the barbell problem, right? Where you have
Yeah.
folks who are down, they can get a small business loan, and then you got folks who can get the large corporation stuff. But what about the folks in the middle? What happens to them?
If they are able to harness the leadership team's energy around personal development, so the leadership team has to be excited about the opportunity to be a buyer. If owner can commit to a plan that would result in this leadership team becoming the successor, then that is the place the most potential. From there, it's all about creating the money. And creating the money is usually the result of growing the business's value. So in the small, medium-sized business space, where you're above the SBA guarantees, but you're not a large corporation, really the whole effort is around compelling a lender to see the successors as being capable. And so we're selling capability in that small, medium-sized business space.
When folks start out their business and they're like, you know what, I'm going to make this business, I'm going to grow it, it's going to be successful. They do that. And then how often do you see that people fail in their succession planning? Because you wrote a book about it. And then two, how often do they fail in actually thinking about the right strategy to exit?
Well, most business owners aren't aware that they have options. They're looking to their peer group to see what they have done, and there might be some leading indicators of what they're capable of doing based on their peer group. When we talk to a business owner about the disposition of their company, we're looking for the avenue that would get them what they want in the timetable that they're seeking it to have that value realized. And then who is it that's going to do that for them? And typically they have three options. One is they could sell to their management team And that requires planning preparation that would be in developing their capabilities to run the business without the owner, and then seeking financing from a bank who is willing to extend them a loan, which would probably be in 2 or 3 transactions to fit within the bank's lending limits. And then the business owner could be out within 7 years. The alternative to that is to prepare your business to sell it to a strategic or a financial or even an owner operator buyer. Is private equity would be financial, strategic would be competitor, and then an owner operator would a person looking for a business they can run and own themselves and use their own money to pay for. To do that, the owner needs to have the business ready for the due diligence of the buyer. And the more sophisticated the buyer is, the deeper the dive in the due diligence will be. And if they're not ready for that, then they tend to get frustrated with the process, experience what we call deal fatigue, and then ultimately the buyer, if they're very sophisticated, will do what they call retrade, which is reduce the price because they found something that scared them. And the third alternative would be for the owner to look to an ESOP, which is an employee stock ownership plan, where they sell their company to the company-sponsored retirement plan, and then all the employees become owners. And that process usually is a lot more enjoyable for an owner because they are able to control it, the timing of it, but it is very complicated and involves a lot of advisory involvement from specialized people in ESOP. So ESOPs tend to scare business owners away because of the complexity. And so of the space for the small, medium-sized business, that in the handle of that dumbbell, you got your management buyout, you got sale to outsiders, or you have an ESOP.
All of which, kind of sound very complicated. And if I'm not, very well versed into that, you talk about this idea of the bankable buyer. So could you kind of talk about can you define that and who actually is the bankable buyer?
If an employee in the company or an employee of another company who knows an owner that they can approach is behaving in accordance with what I would call the ownership mindset. And that ownership mindset is usually made up of a high level of conscientiousness, which means that they pay attention to the details. They don't overlook steps in a process because they're expedient, and they are very conscientious towards the needs of the client or their staff. If they're also very supportive of the staff, meaning they're willing to mentor people, help people develop skills, and these people don't necessarily report to them, then that's a bonus. If they possess those ownership mindset qualities, then I can make them a bankable buyer by grooming them to understand what it takes to be an owner, which involves finance, risk, human resources, talent acquisition, dealing with the stress. And in the process of doing that, I get them ownership through a series of transactions. And our process works in getting the bank behind the buyer so that every purchase that the buyer is following through on, they're using bank funding to do that. So a bankable buyer is someone who's already acting like an owner and now is looking for guidance as to how to become the owner. And we have an open-minded current business owner who's looking for a succession plan.
Do you mind sharing like a quick story of what kind of really embodies what a bankable buyer looks like? This person was a strong manager. He was a bankable buyer, and this is how we coached him to success.
Let me do this first then and tell you what it's not.
Okay.
Is that if this person is very high performing, meaning they're delivering results, and they are unable to get along well with others because they're demanding or commanding or abrupt or condescending, they are not a bankable buyer. So the most common mistake business owners make is recognizing performance and disregarding interpersonal conflict. If there is interpersonal conflict, likelihood of that working in the transition or working its way out in an inappropriate way is very high. Because once that person becomes under duress because of the existence of this debt, the way they deal with that duress then is probably going to be inappropriate, and they're going to scare people off. We need people who are emotionally intelligent, are capable of dealing with the stress in a healthy way, and they are not losing their mind when things aren't going right. I had a client whose key employee bought the business, and in the interview with the bank to get the funding was asked, were you with this business during the 2007 to 2009 real estate crisis? And it was relevant because this business sold building materials to builders. And of course, the manager, he said, He said, yes, I was there. And the banker asked him, how did you deal with that? And he said, well, we basically sucked it up and increased the amount of activity we had in the marketplace and talked to our people about dealing with the stress, and we were able to get through it. And he was an emotionally intelligent person, and the banker lent him the money to buy the company. So the banks are aware of how people behave under duress. And as a consultant who is, like, say, behind the scenes doing the evaluation of the people that might be considered, we are looking for their emotional intelligence. So emotional intelligence to me is a precursor, a prerequisite to becoming a bankable buyer.
It's a great point that you bring up where people identify high performers, but not necessarily the interpersonal conflict of that. What about where it didn't work out, right? So you said about what it looked like, but a lot of people can see, okay, well, I could see myself as being what right looks like, but maybe not so much. Maybe there's other ways of what wrong looks like.
Unwillingness to accept the risks and responsibility that come with ownership. When we introduce ownership to the key employees, we are revealing to them the financial and personal risks that they have. For example, if you're going to buy stock in this company, you are going to sign on the personal guarantee. You are going to pledge your home and all of your liquid assets, with the exception of your retirement plan, as security against that personal guarantee. If this business struggles and it needs money, you may not get paid. You may have to borrow from your house to support yourself, or you may need to borrow from the house to make a capital contribution based upon your ownership. So that's usually where the rubber meets the road, is the unwillingness of either the individual or the individual's life partner or spouse to accept that risk.
How often do people think that, oh, I could be an owner? And then it gets to those conversations and they quickly realize, wait a second, maybe not so much.
Actually, quite often, and we are happy to have that happen because now we've really set expectations for what it means. The majority of the projects we do, Tim, have multiple parties in consideration to buy. And of those parties, not all of them are going along for the ride. If you were reading my book, The Bankable Buyer, you would see, by way of example, what happened when all the leadership team was asked to participate. Some opted out because they were aware of their intolerance for the risk of ownership.
And so let's say we have somebody, they're a founder. How early should they talk about developing the leadership team and gaining that buy-in of who could be the potential folks to take over?
As soon as possible.
So it's funny because you're like the third or fourth person that I've talked about succession planning and how we should do it. Everyone's like, as early as possible. Well, if I'm just starting the business, should I already be thinking about an exit strategy?
Well, that may be a little extreme, Tim, but I have worked with people who are that thoughtful that they built their business with the end in mind. So I would not want to discourage anyone who is chronically planning their life from that. So most of the people we work with are procrastinators, Tim, and
Really?
it's a fairly chronic condition. There's several million businesses right now that are owned still by baby boomers, and the youngest baby boomer is 62. So we're designing exit plans for owners in their 70s. They tend to be founders, and they just had a hard time seeing their life after they sell. And I understand and appreciate that. So I would say that best practice would be to give yourself time to think about what you would do if you were not fully employed by this company and you did not have the 2 or 3 jobs that you have as an owner of the company, what would you do at that time? And it's been my experience that once an owner is able to get a visual image in their mind of what they would do at their time, then they start to engage in the process. And if they're willing to engage in the process, if you give me 3 years at least before you want to start transitioning out, I can design a plan that will ultimately get you paid. I tell my clients, if you give me 7 years, I guarantee you I'll get you your full value.
Let's talk about value real quick. How often do people overestimate the actual value of their company? Because I can only imagine I put my blood, sweat, and tears in this company for 10, 15, 20 years. I know it's worth a million, 2 million, 700 million. And then we go to the table and they're like, actually, it's like 200,000, maybe 1.2K. So, like, how often do you see that?
The lifestyle you live tends to impact your perspective on the value of the business. I have clients who live very high lifestyles out of their business because they're able to pay for things with pre-tax dollars. The reason you see so many SUVs running around the United States is because the tax code encourages buy-in automobiles of a certain size, because then you can deduct them. So you'll see wives and children of business owners driving SUVs. Why? Because the owner can buy it and deduct it. So a lot of value is hidden in the lifestyle that the owner is enjoying out of the business. And when you unpack all that pre-tax lifestyle and expose it to, let's say, normal after-tax living, which is where most people who are not business owners have to manage their budget, then they realize, holy cow, I need a lot more value out of my business than I thought. So that's been my experience, is that the realization of the lifestyle support that a small business owner enjoys usually comes to light once they go through a process of thinking about their future after the business. And that involves what we call normalizing their expenditures in the business so we can do a valuation calculation. And in that process, they are like somewhat stirred to some action. Oh my gosh, I need to think about that and how I'm going to deal with that. And it does impact the timing for some people because the value isn't there to support the lifestyle. I haven't found very many people to really understand how their business is valued. They hear things like 4 times EBITDA. Well, in a 4 times EBITDA transaction, there's a lot of questions around, well, how did you arrive at 4? Why not 5 or 6? And that's where the opportunity exists for planning, because in the projects that we do, we're able to get our owners to get ready for a sale and move that value from, let's say, 3 or 4 times EBITDA to 4, 5, 6, or even 7 times EBITDA. That's quite a surprise. That's a favorable surprise. That's the kind of surprise I like to deliver, Tim. I want that really happy result.
You brought up a good point. Where did they get that, 4 times EBITDA? Is it from their friends or peers or somebody who sold a business? Is like, this is what you should expect?
Well, it tends to be based on the source of funding for the purchase, Tim, in that if you were to borrow money from a bank to buy a company, if the bank was willing to loan you the money to buy a company, the amount of money that they typically would limit their loan to be is 2.5, maybe 2.75 times EBITDA. So if you're making $1 million and you wanted to sell your company and it was going to be sold to somebody who was going to use a commercial bank to finance it, they could probably only borrow 2.5 to 2.75 million. And that leaves, say, another million and a half to come up with. Well, most buyers have less than 10% of the purchase price. So a typical SBA loan, which is where the most challenging transactions occur in the small business space because of the government's willingness to guarantee the spread between the assets and the total value, is 10% buyer cash, 80% bank funding, and then 10% seller retained ownership or seller note. And that limits the value to probably 4 times EBITDA on the high side. So that's why you hear 4 a lot, is because that's usually the upper limit when you sell your company to either management or to owner operator in the small business space. The reason private equity or strategic buyers, which would be a competitor, are paying 6, 7, 8 times earnings as opposed to 4 is because they're coming to the transaction with a lot of their own money. And they would, say, bring 50% of the purchase price to the transaction in their cash. Then they would go to a bank and they would borrow 25 or 30% of the purchase price. And then they would tell the seller, you need to hold on to 20%. So there's your 100% of the purchase price, 50, 30, 20. So that has a lot, the financing has a lot to do with the valuation methodology. Now, if you are running a business like a pop stand and you don't have any processes or systems or people to rely on, and it's all on you, then you're selling a personal service business. You're probably not going to even get 2 times earnings out of it because it's totally reliant on you. Because the transferability of that business's earning potential is what the buyer's evaluating when they investigate the business operations.
So you brought up a really good point about a strategic competitor.
Mm-hmm.
So why would a strategic competitor come in and buy out a company like that?
The reason a strategic competitor would want to buy out another company is to gain that market share, or to gain that labor force, or to gain that expertise or some IP that current provider has. So it's typically an expansion play where they're trying to increase their footprint. They don't want to build it from scratch.
We've talked a lot about the money, the bank, the process, the leadership, the management, who could take over. But what about the folks working in the organization? Because I could only imagine if a strategic competitor comes by, they probably want very specific things, not everybody or everything that comes along with it. So, how often do you find that, owners and buyers and sellers are really talking about what happens to the people we have? What happens to the 100 to 300 employees that we have?
There is the ultimate question, Tim. That is the question we ask our clients routinely. So, what happens the day after you close? And we encourage our clients to share their vision for the disposition of the company in advance of the transaction with their leadership team, because they're the ones who tend to be the most impacted by the change. And if they are able to get buy-in from that leadership team that the future for them is secure because the owner is going to create financial rewards for them tied to the business sale that would then be increased if they chose to stay through the transition, then those people tend to feel safer and they stay with it. I had an example where a gentleman was selling his business to private equity, and he had gone through 6 months of deep due diligence. And the last step in this process was, we want to interview your people. And the owner had not told his senior people that he was selling the company. He called a meeting, and in that meeting, he shared with them his status. He was in the process of selling the company to this private equity group. Well, it's a professional services business, so the income was being originated by these service providers. Two of those service providers walked out of the meeting and took all their personal belongings with them and left. The buyer reduced the purchase price by 25% because those people left and had adversely affected the sustainability of those earnings. So people have a lot more leverage in these transactions than they think. And if they want to try and negotiate with their employer, then that's definitely their opportunity. And I would suggest to owners that if you have key people that are driving results that the buyer is definitely going to be interested in keeping, then they're going to expect you to have a plan to reward those people to stay through the transition, to give the buyer an opportunity to integrate them. And if you don't, and they're a defection risk, then you know that either A, purchase price is going to go down, or payment terms are going to be based upon the ability for that owner to keep that team together.
Great point. And I'm thinking about what you said about how do we keep people, incentivize them to stay around? And how often do folks not truly understand who their key people are? Like they may think who their key people are, but then they go to the selling table, they start having these conversations, then they realize like, oh, I overlooked the key section and now I could potentially be losing 25% of my sale price.
It's really an owner-centric issue, and ego gets in the way. The owner, if their ego is in the way, is going to think, I'm the one who's the hero here. I'm the one who's basically holding it all together. And that's not uncommon for the owner to have that sense of responsibility. However, that works against them in negotiations. If the buyer senses that the business is reliant on that owner, then the buyer is going to either push price down or stretch terms out and force that owner to prove it. So in a case where the owner is looking to maximize value and get the most cash they can at closing, they want to make their key people the heroes. They want their key people to be front and center in the process of revealing information to the buyer about the state of affairs in this company, telling that buyer, this is how we do things here. Here's how we make sure that we minimize our mistakes. Here's how we keep our clients happy. And when the buyer does that, makes the key people the hero, then when the seller does that, then the buyer feels safe, and safe reduce risk, and low risk increases price. So it's in the owner's best interest to identify those people, bring them into the process, reward them for their performance, and provide them a reason to stay through the transition.
Leaders definitely need to manage risk and minimize risk as much as possible. Completely agree. Let's talk about when we're time to exit. How emotional does that get when it comes to actually deciding to leave? And people are like, you know what? I've invested a lot of time and energy. How hard is it for them to actually walk away?
Tends to be very hard, especially for founders. We had an experience with a gentleman who sold his irrigation and millwright business, and he had been in this business in 25 or more years. And he was the type of person that was, I would characterize as stoic. You would never see him express emotion one way or the other, anger, fear, joy. He was just pretty flatlined. And the day that he introduced the new buyers of the company, I watched him break down in tears. And he was trying to hold it back, but he couldn't do it. So it's a very emotional event for people, especially if they're a founder. If you bought the business midstream somewhere and you grew it and now you sold it at a higher level, you may be attached to the people and have a lot of care and affection for them. And you may be an emotional person and you might respond that way. But given what I saw with that gentleman, that suggests to me that it's an extremely emotional experience. And it needs to be treated with respect. And the reason most people choose to not follow through on transactions, and a lot of transactions don't close, is because of that emotion. I don't know who I am without this role.
I don't know who I am without this role. And they won't even sell the business because they're not willing to give up that identity.
There's I consider to be the red zone fumble or the red zone interception. They're in the red zone of the game, and they're in, and the end zone is selling the business, and they get down to the 1 or the 3 yard line, and they haven't thought about who they are and how they're going to express themselves to their community and to their family, and how they feel about their identity. If they haven't done any of that, there's a high likelihood that they're going to come up with a legitimate reason not to sell.
That's interesting. For all the reasons, financial reasons you brought up, the structure of the deal, the strategic competitors, and it boils down to it of it's emotional for me and I can't just give it up. So I'm just going to walk away. I'm going to find a reason. That's amazing. And you said it's more common than not.
Yes, you would never hear anyone say it. It would be something that would be masqueraded by, well, I didn't like the way they put that term in there. And they're not, they, they, they're going to give an excuse, but they're not going to tell you what it is.
No, I get that. So, Byron, is there anything that we didn't talk about that you were like, you know what? I really wish you would ask me this one question?
So what's the biggest financial mistake owners make? And that is they don't ask their people what they want. I find owners to be very reluctant to demonstrate any curiosity into the wants, desires, passions for the people that are working closest to them, their senior leadership team. And if they were able to be courageous enough just to ask them, what is it that you want in your relationship from this company? What can this company help you and your family achieve that if I knew it, I could really get behind and increase the likelihood of it happening? That really moves the needle, in that psychological reciprocity is where one person demonstrates a willingness to have care or interest in the well-being and happiness of another. Then that person who has felt that is going to look for a way to help that person who demonstrated that care and interest. And that's all about getting buy-in. So the business owner says they want to grow the business and achieve these lofty goals. Then if you do it, how was the key employee that was helping you do it? How's their life going to change? How can you connect the outcome you're seeking to theirs and get into alignment? So I would say that would be something I would want your listeners to be aware of, is demonstrate concern for the care and well-being of your team, understand what it is they want. If you don't have the courage to ask them, hire somebody.
And for everyone who is thinking about going into business or selling their business or looking for buyers, or even looking at buying a business, start at the end of this episode and go back and rewatch what Byron just said, because it's incredibly important that people are the heart and soul of your organization, of your business, of what you do. Everything else will fall into place. I can't think of a better way to end on that note. Go in the descriptions. You're going to get Byron's link to his book, his website, and if you want as well, put your LinkedIn information, and that way everyone can get a hold of you and all the greatness that you bring to the table.